All right, welcome in. It's another edition of the Morning After podcast. We got two games to break down. Utah with an impressive, emphatic, no doubt about it, beat down at Oregon State. And then BYU looked like they were on their way to a victory and then not, losing at South Florida and really putting that coaching staff in a bad spot. So, Hans, I'm going to let you choose. Which one do we talk about first?
Could there be two more contrasting games in feelings and emotions?
No. This is as far apart as we've seen Utah and BYU in terms of the emotional state of their fans. Maybe since, I don't know, Lloyd 2004, do you think?
Yes. That sounds about right.
Yeah, it's brutal. But you know what? Let's start where I think most people are going to tune in and listen to the Morning After podcast, and let's start with Utah, Oregon State.
Oh, man, I thought you were going to say BYU. I was like, whoa, what are we doing here?
So Utah just blew that game open right out of the gate. Touchdown drive, 91-yard score after that. It's 14-0. Oregon State never had any chance whatsoever. Hans, you hosted the pre and post, and those are the fun ones to host because there's not a lot of drama. You can prepare, and you've got an excited fan base, too, because I'm sure Ute fans were loving what they saw last night in Corvallis.
Well, everything Utah tried to do, they did right. And it was nice to see Zach Moss back. And you know, we had gotten word, we talked about it on Thursday, Scotty, that it was going to be a 3-week mark and that would be the minimum, but he would deal with pain. And I had reports that he was participating in practice and that he'd be a game-time decision. And Zach Moss shows up for the first handoff. And he ends up with 5 carries for 121 yards, an average of 24.2 yards per carry, and a long of 91 yards, which was a break off of a linebacker's attempt at a tackle and down the sideline for a touchdown. So he was awesome. And then when he wasn't in, Wilmore was fantastic with 12 carries and 60 yards. And if it wasn't Wilmore carrying, it was Green or Brumfield, and both of them got their yardage and their carries, and they all look spectacular. Orlando Umana, the center, gets ejected for helmet-to-helmet collision. He was cleaning up a pile. I know it's crazy to think that an offensive lineman would get ejected, but he was ejected, and they made the transition. Paul Tuala moved into the center spot. He played extremely well. The offensive line looked good. Scotty, they came out in a 4-3 defense like we suspected they might. Frank talked about that on Thursday's preview show, and they came out in a 4-3. They rotated to the 4-2-5, the 4-3 all throughout the evening based off of Oregon State's personnel. And really, it was a great game plan. Everybody participated well inside of it. Everybody hustled, and that's why you had the 52-7 dismantling.
It's probably why we should. It's probably why we should listen a little bit more to Ron McBride, because, you know, on the preview show and throughout the week, you know, I'd mentioned that, hey, Oregon State's kind of got an offense going here. Defensively, they're still a mess, and they showed that. But I thought, hey, you know what? They're scoring some points on a guy. They've got an elite level wide receiver. They're running the ball over 200 yards a game. Their quarterback seems to be finding a bit of a role. And that was my first comment to Ron McBride on Friday was, hey, look, you know what? They're scoring points. Now, defense, they're not good, but offensively, looks like they've got something going. He goes, no, they're still garbage, and Utah's going to win. I'm like, oh, okay. And boy, was he right, too.
Yeah. He said the same thing about Washington State.
Yeah, coach has been spot on. Like, I think it's time we listen to a little bit more about what he says, because the guy has a feel for these teams. And how impressive was that first half? Like, to see Utah get off to like a 35, what was it, 35-0? Is that what it was at halftime?
Yeah, and it was a defensive
35-0. I mean, there was no let up. There was no, you know, we've seen times where Utah, you know, they'll start off maybe with a touchdown right away with the first drive, or maybe even go up 14, and then all of a sudden it dies down, and they get a little complacent, and they just, you know, and they start trying to coast a little bit. But they just put it on them, and they kept going, and it didn't stop. When the second half came, it just kept going and going and getting worse. And it was fun. We haven't seen a team do something like this with Utah. It might have been since since like 04, or maybe even that against Wyoming, whatever year that was. What was that? 2005? I can't remember what year it was when they put it on. When Witt put it on Wyoming. We haven't seen it. Like, I don't even remember the last time they put up 52 points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it was a complete game. That we're talking about those first 30+ points, and that came off of defensive stops, good field position, solid special teams play, the Devin Lloyd interception. That, again, I think that this is the third interception that Bradley and I has caused. Bradley and I tipped this ball to Devin, and Devin was able to go find the end zone with it. And it was based off of pressures. I always, I take the sacks and pass deflections, and I combine them. That means that Utah had basically had 9 sacks in this game with their pass deflections and their pressures, and it was just well executed, Lloyd. And you're right. This is, I don't know, Scotty. Can you think of a more well-rounded dismantling of a Pac-12 team that Utah's had? Maybe
that Oregon's the only one I can really that comes to mind. But even then, that just felt like, it'd have to be Oregon. I don't want to discount that game because Utah just dominated from top to bottom. And that's, and then, you throw in the rushing attack, and then you throw in Huntley, who's nearly perfect on the day, 14 of 17, nearly 250 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. You can't ask for much more than that. You got a running back who's got 5 carries for over 121 yards and 2 touchdowns, and your quarterback throws only 3 incomplete passes and also throws 2 touchdowns and nearly 250 yards. It's as clean and as pure and as perfect of a game that I think Utah, maybe outside of Oregon, has ever played in this conference.
Props to that offensive line, by the way, because you give Tyler Huntley that much time. He was seriously. I think he went through his progressions like 3 times. Sometimes I think he was going through a couple times, like, okay, I got plenty of time here. And then he would find Nakua, or he would find Keithy, or it was that offensive line and losing your center that as early as they did. What was that like? Second series. That playing the way they did, props to them. And I get it. Oregon State's defense isn't great, but still, to go out and do that, especially after you lose your center, is huge.
Well, and I do the combined sacks and pass deflections. Combined sacks and pass deflections, Oregon State had 1. They had 1 pass deflection the whole game and no sacks. And remember that the one defensive stat that we talked about was their TFLs, and they were able to get the back foot a little bit. They were well under the average. They got back there 7 times, but I thought that Utah's offensive line was solid. They were very good. And I do believe that, you take Washington State and Oregon State's defenses, the last 2 Pac-12 teams that Utah's played, and they're probably 2 of the weakest defenses in the conference. But with that said, this offense executed at a very efficient, high level. And Scotty, we talking about Tyler Huntley, we've seen developments and game plans. He only rushed the ball. He only broke the pocket 3 times. He was only rushed 3 times. And we talk about systems that fit and keep quarterbacks healthy. I was talking about Tom Brady on the opener, whatever it was, Thursday, I guess it been Friday, and how long Tom Brady stayed healthy. Well, a lot of that has to do with system. Tyler Huntley and the entire Huntley family needs to thank Ludwig, because if they can keep him in the pocket, delivering the ball, keep him upright, only rushing 3 to 6 times a game, then Huntley's going to extend his career. He'll definitely be around all 12 games, which we're seeing that you need him because of his efficiency. So the way I put it with Frank last night in the postgame was, what we're seeing with Utah offensively is extremely sustainable because you're putting the pressures on a very deep running back core. You're taking a lot of the hits and the pressures off of your quarterback. He's playing at a high level and feeling more comfortable allowing his playmakers to make the plays instead of feeling like he's forced to make them with his own legs. And that is a sustainable offense. That's how That's how our offense was built with the Colts back in the early 2000s. That's how Tom Brady's offense is built. You know, don't put your quarterback in harm's way. And so I feel like this is a sustainable offense that Ludwig has going right now.
It's a good point, too. And I think that throughout all of this, and I'm glad you pointed it out last night on Twitter, you know, how much should we be talking about Andy Ludwig and what he's meant to this team? Because this offense is performing at a far higher level than we've ever seen it in the Pac-12 on a consistent basis. And you're keeping your quarterback healthy. You've overcome some injuries, and this offense is just cruising. And Andy, I know that when he left the first time, I think some Utah fans were ready to move on and see what else this Utah offense could do back in, I think his last year was in 2008. But boy, he's come back, and now you finally see what this is, you know, frankly, this is probably why Kyle Whittingham was shuffling through offensive coordinators. He knew how good an offense could be and just couldn't find the right guy to pull the trigger. And now he's got that right guy, and he deserves all the credit in the world.
Yeah, I'd like him go under center again, too. It's good to see it with, you saw that one goal line stand. Right when I see, you know, Huntley go under center, I'm thinking, oh, yes, that's what they need. They need to just go under center more. When you see that, it's like, it's always good. I'm always going to think about that USC loss, because that USC loss has me thinking what could have been for this Utah team. And I know I brought it up before. I mean, gosh, had they gone under center just one time, they're probably still undefeated.
You know, that USC loss is becoming more and more belligerent. But we talked about that too last night, where you come off the two confident building wins in Northern Illinois and Idaho State and lay this gigantic egg against USC. And Frank and I were talking about how you got to reinforce this Utah team. You played two of the lesser defenses in the conference. You know, these are not the big boys. Washington State lost again to Arizona State. And really explain to these guys, we can't take a 52-7 win and go sit back in our lounge chairs and feel like we've won the season. Like, you've got to stay leaning forward, progressing, interested, engaged, because look at this big old ugly USC letdown. And it really does have to be a teaching tool and a beacon to these kids of remembering what overconfidence and kind of slouching back into a chair can do to you.
So are we ready to make the transition?
Let's do it.
BYU, and so I want to just let people behind the scenes, you know, with the Utah State stuff, I don't have a lot of Saturdays, so I'm trying to get the yard ready. I'm trying to get everything fixed, because I know that, frankly, I don't have another free Saturday until maybe March. And so I'm watching the BYU game. I'm recording it, and it gets to the point where BYU goes up. It's 23-14. Feel like BYU's got a pretty good handle on it. I'm like, okay, I'll watch the rest of it later on tonight. I need to go out and get a few things done. And you, Hans, give me a call about an hour later and say, I can't believe BYU lost that game. In no way, shape, I never in a million years, if you would have given me $1 million and said, bet on this game, I would have bet it all on BYU winning that game, and frankly, winning it comfortably. I wasn't really impressed with South Florida, their offense. Their quarterback looked like he couldn't throw the ball to save his life. A lot of just bad plays. I'm thinking BYU's got complete control of this thing. And so I had to go back and watch it and then rewatch it again to figure out how the heck BYU lost this game. Hans, that was this is a bad one. I mean, there's no other way to put it. That's a really bad, horrific loss, not just for the team, but for the coaches. This one could do some damage here.
Yeah, so I think what I'd like to do is kind of set this up and then hand it over to you and Lloyd and get your thoughts on this, because I just don't know what type of weight to put into it, where you lose Zach Wilson, you go to Jaron Hall, and then you lose Jaron Hall to injury, and Beta Romney has to come in and finish, what was it, the final quarter and a half, or I can't remember exactly what point Beta Romney came in and took over. But you're down to your third-string quarterback. You've lost your starting running back in Tyson. And this offense that put up 439 yards of total offense, 218 on the ground and 221 through the air. They dominated time of possession, 37-30 to 22-30. That's 37 minutes and 30 seconds of offensive possession time for BYU and 22 minutes and 30 seconds for South Florida. And, South Florida, they passed for 72 yards. And you just look at the stats and you're like, well, BYU did this well. Well, you end up with your backup quarterback and then your third string quarterback, and you're low on depth. And then they lost 2 offensive linemen in that game. They already didn't travel Tristan Hodge. They had made 2 other offensive line adjustments. And so I'm looking at a team that's depleted and a team that has no depth and a team that ends up getting beat by South Florida. So the question I would throw, Lloyd, I'll throw it at you, and then Scotty, I'd like to hear it from you. How much does anybody want to hear about injuries or any excuses when it comes to a loss to South Florida?
I'm going to say not a lot. I think where they kind of lost this game was where it's kind of like that for them to run. I mean, South Florida rushed for 243 yards.
Yeah.
I mean, Jordan Cronkite, Walter Cronkite's great grandson, I think.
Stop.
I can't confirm that.
Yeah.
But he went for 158 and 2 touchdowns. Like where BYU typically doesn't get beat is down on the defensive front and the linebackers.
Used to be.
Like usually,
definitely not this year.
No, not this year. And the fact that they had this game and that they gave up 13 points in the fourth quarter. I think that's what it was, wasn't that? Yeah. Well, in the fourth quarter. That's where. Go ahead.
I would say the majority of the rushing yards probably came in that second half, really engaging in the back part of the third quarter. It was South Florida actually found a formula, I think, just before the half with a couple of really big rushing drives, and then came out in the third and applied those rushing drives, and then in the fourth just crushed BYU with them. Is that injuries? When I see a team that gives up that falls like that in the fourth quarter, I think conditioning. I think about how hot. I think about when Scotty was just at LSU and how hot it was there and how miserable it probably was in Florida. I mean, how much does all that play into it? Well, I think a lot of it's scheme. I saw BYU had come out and they started with 4 downs, and then there was a really, really nice defensive stop. I think it was back into the second quarter where they went 4 downs and they got Wilgar up off the edge and they jammed everything down. And if it wasn't a 3 and out, then it was maybe a first down off of a 1st and 10, and then a 3 and out after that. And defense just stopped them up. And then BYU goes back to the 3 downs. And I don't know if you guys were watching some of my tweets, but I tweeted out 2 or 3 clips of the BYU defensive edge getting, not only did they get hooked, but you got to go watch how they get hooked and collapsed down into the middle of the pile. And it was like, it's like swinging a door open and having everything behind the door blocked, and that running back was just running right through the door. And, you got to go back and look at personnel and say, hey, why can you not jam the edge and not get reached? But you also go back to the coaches and say, when the guys are getting jammed and logged, why are you not running 4 downs and just saying, okay, screw everything else. We are not going to let this run off the edge get us anymore. And so I would put it 70% on scheme defensively, what South Florida did, because it felt like when they had the proper lineups out there and the proper scheme, it felt like South Florida had a hard time running against it.
Let me just give you the overall timing of what happened here. And this is why I don't think BYU fans want to hear about injuries, especially on the offensive side of the ball, because when Jaron Hall leaves the game, on his last drive. He gets them down into field goal range. There's 11:20 left to go in the fourth quarter. He takes BYU on a drive that was 10 plays, 53 yards, 3.5 minutes, gets him into field goal range, and Oldroyd missed the 39-yard field goal. At that point, BYU's still leading the game. So when he leaves, BYU's up 23-21. Then
should have been up 26-21.
Exactly. So he put him in a position where it's 26-21. Now, granted, South Florida on their next drive goes on a 9-play, 78-yard drive. They score the touchdown. At that point, they're up 27-23. But then, if you look, and I'm not blaming Oldroyd. I'm just blaming multiple people in this game. So then Romney then takes BYU down on a long play drive, gets them in, certainly would have been field goal range had it been 27-26. BYU needs to go for it at that point, and they come up a yard shy of getting the first down. The defense then holds. BYU then gets down once again, but just essentially runs out of time before they can try to punch it in and try to win the game. But, you look at it from top to bottom, and there were multiple opportunities, even with the injuries, for BYU to, first off, extend the lead, and second of all, even win the game down the stretch. And there's just not the ability to get it done. And Romney was thrown in a bad situation, but got BYU up and down the field a little bit. They just couldn't punch it in. And so I don't think there's a lot of BYU fans that want to hear about injuries. I think they want to hear about scheme, like you talked about on the defensive side. They want to talk about short yardage situations. They want to talk about inability to convert inside the red zone. Touchdowns, that is. They want to talk about special teams. There's just a lot of things like, the botched punt snap. I mean, there's so many different little unforced errors that BYU had yesterday that I think have people a little cranky and salty this morning.
Totally understandable. Yeah.
You look at South Florida, like that's what's kind of maddening is, I mean, they weren't even attempting to really throw. They threw 14 times.
Yeah.
The guy threw for 72 yards. Like, I feel like that's playing right into what BYU should be able to stop. I mean, there was not even a threat to pass. So that's a little bit concerning. A little bit, if I'm a BYU fan, a little frustrating.
Yeah, the scary thing is there was threat to pass, and there were 3 or 4 broken deep that would have been touchdowns, but the quarterback had no accuracy.
Right.
That is not a good South Florida quarterback.
No.
And that South Florida offense would have been dead in the water if BYU would have just stopped the run. It could have happened. And they did have the one touchdown pass. I can't remember if it was to the tight end. I know that people were after Bo Tanner because he was jogging, but from what I understand, he tweaked his hamstring and couldn't move. And I know that Tristan Hodge, that's why he didn't travel, was a hamstring issue. But if you just take that runaway and force South Florida to throw, you're going to end up with interceptions or batted balls or pressure or something. But you just couldn't stop the run. And when they opened up the floodgates, it was crazy just watching South Florida. Every one of the 5 offensive linemen pulled multiple times in different drives. And they're pulling all over the field. And the tackles were just reaching and jamming the defensive ends. The pullers were blowing out the outside linebackers that were about a 4-yard depth. And the running backs were having multiple looks up A gap, B gap. And it was just like the floodgates were open, and BYU just didn't make adjustments. Well, they did make some adjustments, but then they got away from the adjustments. But I don't know why.
Yeah,
I don't know why they went back to a 3-man front. If they felt like that was going to be stopping, or if they were so worried about the 3 times that they were beat over the top that should have been touchdowns that were overthrown. Like if they're thinking, oh man, there's going to be some quick strikes and we've got to stay deep. But I don't know. I don't want to pretend that I know more than these defensive coordinators or these coordinators because I don't. They watch 10 times the film I do and 10 times the game planning. And we watch it from this, away from the earth point of view and try to make our judgments based off that. But it sure felt strange watching 3 downs, the forward backs deep, and South Florida just time and time again, just run and jam, and get first down after first down on long drives. It was bizarre.
Well, you mentioned, you go back to the Utah, Oregon State, and they talked about, look, this is what Oregon State does well. They're running for over 200 yards. You might see the old 4-3 back or the 4-down lineman, and Utah made that adjustment and took Oregon State completely out of the game. And BYU at times looked like they were ready to do that and then did not. It's that ability to make adjustments. It's ability to, stretch out a little bit from who you are into fitting up against the strength of an offense. And BYU just didn't do that on a continual basis in that game.
Yep. And then offensively, I put 1 or 2 clips out there, and I know that there were some offensive line injuries, and I know you had some new and experienced guys in there, but I put a clip of a guard completely whiffing, and I don't understand why the center stepped backside on this play side, but instead of stepping into a double team, it looked like the guard was thinking that there was going to be center help, but defensive tackle just comes in the backfield with a simple tackle for a 3-yard loss, and this happened a couple times.
Yeah.
And I just don't have an answer for it. I try to understand exactly how it all fell apart, but Scotty, this is a South Florida team that ended up with 6 sacks against BYU and 13 TFLs. I'm just going to give you both heads up that that's not good.
My expert opinion, that's not good.
Not good at all, Bob.
It's like a dentist. That's like a dentist looking at a 24-year-old Hans Olsen teeth and being like, "Son, did you sleep with caramel in your mouth? Because you've got 8 teeth that need root canal. This is bad." I'm a little bit perplexed by, and I'm with you. Like, I know you've got to talk about the injuries, but I'm with you. This is South Florida, and I know that Will Snowden did a great job talking about the speed and the potential dangers of South Florida. And we did talk about their TFLs.
We did.
Will was spot on, by the way. Will was spot on, dude. That guy, if you're not listening to the Cougar preview show, I mean, you better tune in, because Will was, everything he said kind of came. I mean, yeah, they do have athletes, and I mean, Will was. I just will say, and he was spot on with his breakdown of how this thing could go wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, and they've got those athletes, but even with all that said, this is still a huge letdown loss. Now we watched, in fact, the game that started and played just before BYU South Florida was Toledo versus Bowling Green, and Toledo had beat Bowling Green for the last 9 years, and that is a rivalry. And they had beat them for the last 9 years. So basically a BYU-Utah situation yesterday. And Bowling Green, it's their first win over Toledo in 9 years. And Toledo looked inept. They just looked horrible. And I'm watching that game, and I'm like, this is the Toledo team that beat BYU? And I even sent out a tweet before the BYU game started that said, watching Toledo lose to Bowling Green is disconcerting. And that gave me cause for concern, because Bowling Green is terrible.
Yeah.
And South Florida is not good. I mean, they're ranked below 100 in, I think, 5 different defensive categories. And so it's inexplicable. And I don't even know how much Kalani and his staff want to hear the excuses of injury. They may use it because you need to talk about it, but at the same time, they're going to own this. They have to own it. There was a bad loss.
Yeah. Well,
don't look now, but we got a real hootenanny against with Utah and Arizona State coming up.
It's PK week on the station.
Gosh, I'm telling you, Utah fans, if they fall to Arizona State, they're going to lose their mind on PK. They might absolutely lose their mind.
Well, and then
he's going to get in the craw of all of them.
And then you got BYU taking on Boise State, and they lost their starting quarterback, and then the backup came in and threw for a ton of yards. And I thought Hawaii might give them a little bit of trouble because Hawaii's been playing pretty well, but they ended up winning that game. I think it was like 52-37 or something like that. So Boise's cruising, and they're heading into LaVell Edwards Stadium, and certainly that's going to be a massive challenge because Boise has not been ranked this high since, I believe, 2016. They'll be a top 13, top 14 team in the country when the polls get released Saturday.
You think Utah jumps them?
They might.
Utah's sitting right behind them.
They might. If there's somebody out there might look at the points Hawaii scored and said, oh, they gave up some points in that game. I don't think they will, but I don't know. I'm not.
Utah would have got a nice bump. USC would have beaten Notre Dame. That would have been.
That would have been nice. Win. But even
been 2 top 10 wins for them.
Yeah, but even considering the fact that USC kept it as close as they did, I mean that's a 3-point game. That's 30-27. Yeah, that might give USC. That might help out the Pac-12 a little bit. So, all right, a lot to break down this week, and of course we'll have all the coverage for you. You'll hear from Kalani Sitake and Kyle Whittingham coming up tomorrow on the show. Show kicks off at noon. That's your morning after podcast. Scott Garrard, Hans Olsen, and Lloyd Cole right here on 97.5, 1280 The Zone and the Zone Sports Network.